it was in the middle of quarantine. I took it real serious, at least in Houston. It was pretty serious. Everybody's home all the time for months and months.
Yeah. How'd you
I
even
saw
find a mic during that time? Like they
That's
were
a great
so hard to
question.
get.
They were hard to get, and I did get a professional mic, and it was very difficult to do. I actually think I borrowed it my first mic from somebody. If you want
Nice.
to know the truth, I found somebody that had done radio before, and I think I borrowed a mic from them. But I remember sitting there during quarantine and watching mainly social media and just thinking, God dang, this is just all so negative. And where are the leaders? I know a bunch of people that are positive leaders. Why don't we hear from them? And I started thinking, that's my podcast. I'm going to start interviewing people that are positive people, that are good leaders, that maybe you don't hear quite as much about because they just go about their business day to day and they're not making a big stink out of everything. And then my wife, originally, and I think a lot of podcasts are like such and such with Robert Ingalls, such and such, Brian Beckcom's podcast, blah, blah, blah. My wife said, why don't you call it Lessons from Leaders? And I go, boom, Lessons from Leaders. Great name, has alliteration. Plus, how do you think this pitch is? Hey, Robert, I have a leadership podcast. I would like you to come on. Instead of saying, I would like you to come on Brian Beckham's podcast, I have a leadership
Right.
podcast. And so it is very, very easy because of the focus of my podcast to get guests to come on, quite frankly. But that's kind of the conceit or the notion behind my podcast and how I got started. So talk a little bit about when you're coaching people, when you're teaching professionals how to start podcasts, and you're asking like, what is it about? What's it going to be called? What's the focus? Like what you tell people.
Yeah, so if I was talking to a family law attorney, I would say, why are we doing it? Because there's a few big reasons that an attorney might consider doing it. The primary one I see, especially among practitioners like family law, personal injury, criminal, states, is FAQ. They are speaking directly to the questions that a prospect has to nurture that lead in the funnel. And so we know what they want to know. They ask it in every consult. And so, but then there's the other one that we see a lot, which is we're going to create something for our colleagues or our referral sources, people that will end up sending us business. And if we write a book, these are people that follow us that will buy that book. These are, fans that we're creating. And so why are we doing it? Establish that. And I really do my best, and I usually am successful at convincing them not to merge the two into one, because that is frequently that's something that comes up is, well, can't I just do like one episode like this and one episode like this? Yes, you absolutely can. But I tell people to think about the podcast you listen to. Do they do that?
Yeah.
It's very rare that every episode of a successful podcast isn't for, their avatar. They're usually thinking every episode should be for that avatar. And that doesn't mean certain episodes won't draw different people. Oh, I'm interested in this specific thing. But if you are educating personal injury attorneys about the finer points of trial work, and then they subscribe to that podcast, and every other episode, you're talking about whether they should see a chiropractor, and they're like, wait, what? No, I know. Like, what? It's to them, it would be very strange. Like, why is he peppering in stuff for his clients when this podcast is intended for me to learn about how to be a better trial lawyer? And you're doing the same thing with any area. Now, if you're doing stuff for clients, I don't think clients are going to care as much, because clients aren't subscribing to your podcast if it's a FAQ model. They're showing up, they're getting the information they want, and they're probably hiring you and maybe never thinking about the podcast again. That's great, because it was a lead nurture. You nurtured the lead, they converted. Boom. We don't need them to subscribe to a podcast like that. And so you don't really need to worry what else is on the feed for them too much. But for the other, if you're making this other stuff on the feed, you're just confusing a listener. If you're trying to have subscribers, if any of those people should be subscribers, you're confusing people. Yeah. And I think it makes for a bad experience. And I tell people, if you want to do two things, make two podcasts. It's not that much more complicated to have a second. Like once the pieces are in place to distribute a second podcast, there's a little heavy lifting in the beginning. But I would much prefer somebody do one thing than try to do two things poorly.